the price of water. Once it was paradise, a dreamland where millions flocked to find their peace of sunshine and salt air. Florida, that narrow peninsula jutting into crystal waters, has always been defined by its relationship with the sea. But what happens when that relationship turns toxic? When the very ocean that built an empire of tourism and real estate begins to take it all back? The water is rising. Not someday, not in some distant future your grandchildren might worry about. It's happening now, silently claiming streets, homes, and dreams with each passing tide. You've seen the headlines about climate change and rising seas, but nobody told you it would happen this fast, this dramatically, with this much at stake. Some call it the greatest real estate crisis in American history. Others, the beginning of a modern exodus. But wait until you see what we found beneath the surface, where money, power, and denial created the perfect storm that nobody wants to talk about. Paradise had a different meaning in Florida during the 1920s and 30s. This was the era when America discovered the Sunshine State, when train cars packed with Northerners would arrive in Miami and Tampa, disgorging passengers into a landscape of swaying palms and endless possibilities. We all remember those vintage postcards, smiling families on pristine beaches, glamorous hotels rising from former swampland, and that particular shade of turquoise water that seemed to promise eternal summer. Florida wasn't just a state, it was an emotion, a fever dream of new beginnings where anyone could reinvent themselves with a plot of land and enough sunshine. The coast wasn't something to fear back then. The sea was a backdrop, a selling point, an amenity to be conquered and parceled and sold by the foot.
And so they came in waves, first the wealthy, then the middle class, then the retirees. Each generation carving deeper into the wetlands, building closer to the shore, pushing the boundary between land and water, as if nature itself could be permanently redrawn by human ambition. But nature keeps its own ledger, and the bill always comes due. Take Fort Lauderdale, once branded as the Venice of America for its intricate canal system. Those canals, originally dug to drain the wetlands and make more land available for development, are now becoming the city's undoing. On clear, sunny days, what locals now call blue sky flooding, salt water pushes up through storm drains and sewers, bubbling onto streets and into gardens. No rain necessary, just the inexorable pressure of rising tides. Carol Brighton has lived in her waterfront home for 27 years.
The first time it happened, we thought it was a fluke, she tells us, standing ankle-deep in seawater on what should be her dry driveway. Then it started happening every few months, then monthly. Now I track the tide charts like some people check the weather. Behind her, plastic garbage bags are stacked against her garage door, a makeshift barrier that barely contains the encroaching sea. Each time, the water comes higher and stays longer. I've already lost one car to salt damage. The insurance company dropped me last year, but Carol isn't leaving, not yet. Where would I go? Who would buy this house knowing what comes with each full moon? Her neighborhood, once among the most desirable in the city, has seen property values drop 35% in just 4 years. But wait until you see what happens when the next major hurricane makes landfall. The numbers tell a story that few want to acknowledge. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, sea levels along Florida's coast have risen 8 inches since 1950, but the rate is accelerating. Their projections show another 1 to 4 feet of rise by 2050, depending on how quickly global temperatures increase. 4 feet may not sound catastrophic until you realize that over 6 million Floridians, nearly a third of the state's population, live in coastal areas that sit less than 10 feet above sea level. Miami-Dade County alone has more than $30 billion of property sitting less than 3 feet above the current high tide line. For reference, Hurricane Irma's storm surge in 2017 reached nearly 15 feet in some parts of the Keys. We all watch the footage of flooded streets and stranded residents, but what if that wasn't just a storm, but the new normal? Scientists now believe that what is currently considered a once-in-a-century flood in South Florida could become a monthly occurrence by 2040. Think about that. Disaster as routine, emergency as everyday life. But the most shocking part? Despite these projections, Florida approved more than 16,000 new residential units in high-risk coastal zones just last year alone. There seems to be a profound disconnect between what we know and what we do. It's almost as though we're building sandcastles below the tide line, hoping somehow that the next wave won't come. The invisible cost of this crisis reveals itself in unexpected ways, seeping into daily life like the salt water now corroding the foundations of coastal buildings. In Miami Beach, restaurant owner Miguel Sanchez shows us the newly installed pumps in his storage room, a $40,000 investment he was forced to make after losing his entire inventory twice in 1 year to flooding. The city installed those big pumps on the main streets, he explains, referring to Miami Beach's much-publicized $200 million system that pumps floodwater back into the bay. But they don't help the side streets where businesses like mine are located, so we adapt on our own or we go under. The phrase "go under" has taken on a literal meaning here. Miguel now receives deliveries only in the morning, when tides are typically lower. He's raised all his electrical outlets 3 feet up the walls and replaced wooden furniture with plastic and metal that won't rot. This is the cost of doing business in paradise now, he sighs. But these adaptations come with another price. Miguel has had to raise his prices 30% in 2 years just to cover the flood-proofing expenses. Many of his longtime local customers can no longer afford to dine there. They understand, but they still cannot pay. So now I depend more on tourists who don't know any better. But what happens when the tourists stop coming too? Behind closed doors, in air-conditioned offices far from the flooding streets, a different kind of calculation is taking place. Florida's real estate industry, valued at over $1 trillion, faces an existential threat that few are willing to discuss openly. We gained exclusive access to 3 confidential meetings between major developers, insurance executives, and banking officials. What we heard reveals the grim reality behind the sunny promotional brochures. The internal models show we have maybe 15 to 20 years before underwriting properties in certain zip codes becomes financially untenable, explained one insurance executive who asked to remain anonymous. We're already quietly reducing our exposure in the highest risk areas. A prominent Miami developer was more blunt. Everyone in this room knows the game. Get in, build it, sell it, and get out before the market realizes what's coming. The music's still playing, so we're still dancing. This short-term thinking has created what economists now call the coastal real estate bubble, a market that continues to function only because enough people either don't know or don't want to acknowledge the looming crisis. But the signs of the bubble's edges fraying are already visible to those who know where to look. Mortgage delinquencies in flood-prone zip codes have increased 62% faster than in comparable inland areas over the past 4 years. Banks have begun quietly extending the geographic zones where they require flood insurance. And multiple sources confirmed that major investment firms are now incorporating sea-level projections into their 30-year mortgage calculations, effectively redlining certain coastal areas without publicly admitting it. There won't be one dramatic crash, a banking regulator told us off the record. It will be more like air slowly leaking from a tire until one day you realize you can't drive on it anymore. The human face of this slow-motion disaster often belongs to those with the fewest resources to adapt. In Shorecrest, a working-class neighborhood north of downtown Miami, Lucia Fernandez has watched her community transform from a vibrant, family-friendly area to what locals now grimly call the bathtub. 6 times last year, she carried her children through knee-deep water just to reach their school bus stop. They know to wear plastic bags over their shoes and to carry their books in waterproof backpacks, she says. Unlike the wealthy owners of high-rise condos or the snowbirds with second homes, Lucia and her neighbors can't simply relocate. The bank owns most of my mortgage, and who would buy this place now? Besides, my whole family is here. My job is here. Where would we go that we could afford? The cruel math of climate displacement is already forcing impossible choices on communities like Shorecrest. City services are gradually being reduced. Garbage collection becomes sporadic during flood events, and emergency response times have tripled in 5 years. Meanwhile, property taxes remain steady or even increase to fund adaptation measures that often prioritize wealthier neighborhoods. They built those fancy pumps in South Beach for the tourists and the millionaires, Lucia notes bitterly, while we're told to buy flood insurance we can't afford and hope for the best. What's happening in Shorecrest offers a preview of what some researchers call climate gentrification, a process where rising waters force lower-income residents from previously undesirable higher ground, which suddenly becomes prime real estate. We're witnessing the first stages of a massive demographic redistribution driven not by preference or opportunity, but by water itself. But wait until you hear what local officials revealed when they thought the cameras weren't rolling. Behind the public assurances and ribbon cuttings for new flood control projects lies a troubling reality. Many of Florida's elected officials and civil servants privately acknowledge that their efforts are merely buying time. In a moment of startling candor, one county flood management director admitted to us, "We're playing a game of whack-a-mole with physics, and physics always wins eventually. These pumps, these seawalls, they're designed for conditions that will be obsolete before their installation is even paid off." The fundamental problem is that much of Florida's coastal development sits on porous limestone, often compared to Swiss cheese. This means that water doesn't just come from above or from the sides, it literally rises through the ground itself. Traditional flood defenses like seawalls, which might work in cities built on clay or granite, are largely ineffective here. "You can build a wall around your house," explains Dr. Karen Bolter, a geoscientist who studies Florida's flooding challenges, "but if the water is coming up through your floor, what's the point?" This geological reality transforms what might be a manageable engineering problem elsewhere into an existential threat here. Yet, despite these known limitations, Florida continues to approve coastal development plans that make little mention of these fundamental challenges. The state's own climate adaptation documents acknowledge that certain areas will likely need to be abandoned. Yet public officials rarely incorporate this uncomfortable truth into their public statements. There's an enormous gap between what we know needs to happen and what is politically possible to say out loud, confessed one state environmental official who requested anonymity. Nobody gets elected on a platform of managed retreat. The economic stakes of Florida's water crisis extend far beyond its beaches and condos. The state's economy, built on a foundation of tourism, agriculture, and ever-expanding real estate development, now faces disruption on multiple fronts simultaneously. Consider the case of Florida's citrus industry, already battling disease and foreign competition, now confronting saltwater intrusion into the freshwater aquifers that sustain its groves. In the agricultural areas south of Miami, farmers have watched their wells turn brackish as the ocean permeates the porous limestone beneath their land. "My father and grandfather pulled sweet water from 30 feet down," explains third-generation farmer Richard McKinney. "Now we're at 60 feet and still getting salt. Each year we have to drill deeper, and each year the salt follows. The cost of irrigation has tripled for many farmers, while yields decline. Some have switched to more salt-tolerant crops, while others have sold to developers, ironically converting farms threatened by saltwater into new housing developments equally vulnerable to the rising seas." Meanwhile, Florida's tourism industry, which generates more than $90 billion annually and employs nearly 1 million people, faces its own reckoning. Beach erosion is accelerating, with some popular stretches losing several feet per year. Hotel owners now budget millions for beach renourishment, essentially dredging sand from offshore and pumping it back onto eroding beaches. "It's a never-ending treadmill," admits one hotel association executive. "We're spending more each year to maintain less beach, and everyone knows it's just a temporary fix." But the economic ripples spread even further. The workers who clean those hotel rooms, staff those restaurants, and maintain those golf courses often live in the very low-lying areas most vulnerable to flooding. When they can't get to work because their streets are underwater, the entire economic ecosystem suffers. We are witnessing the early stages of what economists call a climate feedback loop, where physical changes trigger economic changes, which then accelerate the impacts of the physical changes. But some have found ways to profit from this impending disaster, creating an entirely new economy built around Florida's watery future. We don't use the term climate change in our marketing materials, explains Cameron Wright, founder of Coastal Adaptation Partners, one of dozens of new companies that have emerged to serve Florida's flood-prone communities. We talk about water management challenges or infrastructure resilience. It's the same problem, but the language matters when you're working in certain counties. His firm has grown from 3 employees to 47 in just 4 years, specializing in home elevations, flood-proofing renovations, and consulting on amphibious architecture, buildings designed to float during flood events. Business is booming, he acknowledges with a complicated smile. There's a bitter irony in profiting from what's essentially a slow-moving catastrophe, but someone has to help people adapt. Wright's company represents just one facet of what some now call the adaptation economy, a rapidly expanding sector that includes everything from advanced pumping systems to novel construction materials, specialized insurance products, and even managed retreat consulting for municipalities considering which neighborhoods to surrender to the sea. The irony is not lost on Wright. The same crisis that's destroying some fortunes is creating others.
We're literally building an economy around managing decline. Perhaps most telling is the emergence of specialized real estate services focused on helping buyers identify properties with higher elevation or better drainage, what locals sometimes call climate gentrification consultants. One such advisor told us candidly, "Smart money is already moving to higher ground." The question isn't whether to retreat from the coast, it's who gets to retreat first and who gets left holding worthless property. The psychological toll of living in a place that may not exist in its current form within a generation is profound and largely unaddressed. Psychologists have begun documenting what they call climate grief among longtime coastal residents, a complex emotional response that includes denial, anxiety, and a deep sense of loss for what's already gone and what's yet to be lost.
I've lived on this street for 42 years, explains Eleanor Jenkins, a retired teacher in Neptune Beach near Jacksonville. I used to know exactly what to expect from the tides, the storms, the seasons. Now, nothing is predictable. It feels like losing a loved one, that same sense that the world isn't what you thought it was. This sentiment is echoed across the state's 1,600 miles of coastline, cutting across political and demographic lines. Climate grief manifests in measurable ways. Florida has seen a 28% increase in anti-anxiety medication prescriptions in flood-prone zip codes over the past decade, compared to a 12% increase statewide. Support groups have formed in multiple coastal communities, not for political activism, but simply to process the emotional weight of watching one's community gradually surrender to water. We're the first generation having to grapple with this, explains Dr.
Margaret Hollins, a psychologist who specializes in environmental anxiety. Previous generations dealt with acute disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, but not the slow, inexorable loss of the places they call home. There's no psychological roadmap for this. Perhaps most poignant are the new rituals emerging in the most vulnerable communities. Goodbye ceremonies for abandoned buildings, memorial photography projects documenting streets before they're permanently flooded, time capsules buried on higher ground containing artifacts from low-lying neighborhoods. These aren't just expressions of nostalgia, they're attempts to create meaning amid unprecedented change. Humans need closure, Dr. Hollins notes, and there's no funeral for a neighborhood that drowns inch by inch. The future that awaits Florida depends largely on choices being made today, not just locally, but globally. Even with immediate and dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, some degree of additional sea level rise is already locked in due to the warming that has already occurred. The question is no longer if Florida will transform, but how quickly and how drastically. Dr. Harold Wanless, a geologist who has studied Florida's coastline for more than 40 years, offers a sobering assessment. Based on what we're seeing in ice sheet dynamics, particularly in Greenland and West Antarctica, I think we're looking at minimum 6 to 8 feet of sea level rise this century. That's not a worst-case scenario. That's where the data points. Such a rise would render uninhabitable vast swaths of coastal Florida, from the Keys to Jacksonville. More conservative estimates from agencies like NOAA still project between 2 and 4 feet by 2100,
enough to radically reshape the state's geography and economy. The difficulty in planning lies partly in the uncertainty of the timeline. The sea won't rise like filling a bathtub, steadily and predictably, explains coastal engineer Dr. Jennifer Morris. It will accelerate in fits and starts, with periods of apparent stability punctuated by sudden jumps. This makes adaptation incredibly challenging because infrastructure designed for conditions in 2040 may be obsolete by 2050. Despite these challenges, innovative approaches are emerging. Some communities are experimenting with floating infrastructure, others with novel zoning codes that require new construction to be easily relocatable. Miami-Dade County has begun incorporating adaptation action areas into its comprehensive plan, essentially designating zones where different strategies will be implemented, from aggressive defense to eventual surrender. The most forward-thinking municipalities are already planning for managed retreat, the coordinated movement of people and infrastructure away from the most vulnerable areas. But these efforts remain piecemeal and inconsistent, varying dramatically from one jurisdiction to another. It's not just a failure of imagination, says urban planner Marcus Gillespie, it's a failure of governance. We have 20th century institutions trying to solve a 21st century problem that transcends electoral cycles and jurisdictional boundaries. How much are we willing to pay for water views? For decades, oceanfront property commanded premium prices based on the assumption that proximity to the sea would always be desirable. Now, as that same water becomes a threat rather than an amenity, we're being forced to recalculate the true cost of living on the edge of a rising ocean. The numbers are staggering. Miami-Dade County alone estimates it needs at least $20 billion for flood adaptation infrastructure over the next 20 years, nearly $7,000 per county resident. Even with those investments, some neighborhoods will still need to be abandoned. The Florida Division of Emergency Management projects that statewide adaptation costs could exceed $200 billion by mid-century. Meanwhile, mortgage lenders and insurance companies are quietly retreating from the highest risk areas, creating what some experts call climate redlining, though few will acknowledge it publicly. Perhaps most telling is what's happening to 30-year mortgage availability in certain zip codes, the financial industry's clearest signal about an area's long-term viability. The private market is making decisions based on risk that our political system hasn't been willing to acknowledge, explains economist Dr. Janet Friedman. When banks stop offering 30-year mortgages in your neighborhood, they're essentially saying they don't believe your property will maintain its value for the duration of the loan. This financial realignment is happening with little public discussion, even as it reshapes Florida's communities and wealth distribution. Those with resources are already beginning a subtle migration to higher ground, while others remain trapped by underwater mortgages or lack of options. The great irony is that the same market forces that drove Florida's coastal development boom are now beginning to operate in reverse, but without the same transparency or oversight. As one real estate analyst put it bluntly, Florida is experiencing the first major unplanned real estate contraction in American history that's not driven by an economic recession, but by physics. Empty tables, empty streets, empty dreams. As we conclude our journey through Florida's watery predicament, the contrast between the state's sun-drenched image and its precarious reality could not be starker. We've seen families trapped in homes they can't sell, communities divided between those who can afford to adapt and those who cannot, and an entire economic system built on assumptions about permanence that no longer hold true. The water is coming, not as a single catastrophic flood, but as a slow, inexorable force reshaping every aspect of life in the Sunshine State. Yet amidst this sobering reality, we've also witnessed remarkable resilience and innovation. Communities developing novel approaches to living with water rather than fighting it. Individuals finding meaning and purpose in helping their neighbors adapt. Young activists demanding that their inheritance, both environmental and economic, be protected through honest planning and bold action. Perhaps Florida's true test isn't whether it can hold back the sea. It's whether it can transform itself into something new while preserving what matters most. The state has always been defined by reinvention, from the early Seminole inhabitants who adapted to its watery landscape to the developers who reimagined swampland as paradise. Now comes its most profound reinvention yet, learning to thrive in a future where the line between land and sea is no longer fixed but fluid. Maybe there's still hope in this shifting landscape, a coast glowing in silence, a people finding new ways to define home. We saw it happen, the slow surrender of certain streets giving way to new possibilities elsewhere. It's time we remember what Florida has always been, not just a place, but an idea, one that must now evolve with the changing tides. If you felt this change too, share your story in the comments.
And if you found this eye-opening, subscribe. The next story might reveal where everyone's going next.